Good morning, everyone, on this lovely Tuesday morning. Thank you for joining us for this session. We've got an extremely distinguished panel with us to discuss some of the issues at hand. I'll start with some introductions and then make some opening remarks and then hand over to the panel to hear their thoughts. We will have some time for Q&A as well. So that's the shape of the session this morning. So on my left, we've got, and I'm going to refer to my notes just to make sure that I get this absolutely right with everybody. On my left, we have, we've got Sam Friedman. He's author of Failed State, Why Nothing Works and How We Fix It. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. We've got Tom Webb, former advisor to Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and see that you're. And I'll let Tom do the rest of his introduction in a moment. We've got Lord Victor Adebowale, CBE. He's a chair of Social Enterprise UK and chair of the Board of Trustees at IPPR. But Victor, I've got 7 more paragraphs here. Okay. And we've got Caroline Elsom, head of Reshaping the State at Onward. So that's our extremely distinguished panel I'll be chairing today. I'm Associate Director for Public Services at IPPR. Tom, can you graciously and kindly add a little bit to your introduction, because I didn't have it written down on my page.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a special advisor to the Prime Minister on public sector reform, health and social care, and science and technology. But before that, I was 3 years the Director of Policy in opposition, leading up to the manifesto.
Thank you very much, Tom. Okay, and so this session is designed to talk about how Labour and government can deliver in terms of public services and the state for working people. Grandly titled Active Government in Uncertain Times. I'll start with a few opening remarks about the context, and then hopefully we can move over to our panel for some opening remarks. The first thing that I'd like to say is, I think it's not said enough that the government has had one of the worst inheritances in terms of public services in recent decades. You might kind of look at 1997 and feel like there's some comparable elements there, but things are actually much harder. The first reason is the fiscal context. Is much more difficult. If you look at things like growth over the last decade, very challenging, and also kind of debt to GDP ratio, those kind of indicators, there's just less money in the system to invest in services. And the other point around the context that's worth mentioning is the demographic headwinds. We've got a kind of structural shift in the way that our society is made up, so that we've got an aging population putting more and more pressure on services as the overall structure of the population changes. There's a challenging political context. I mean, you might say it's chicken and egg, but there's a massive and rising populist movement. Reform is a realistic threat for the first time in memory, and there are elements of the far right that are kind of marching on our streets, and those kind of things raise the stakes for government in turning their great ambitions into reality. Gloom. There is hope and optimism on the cards. The government has already launched some ambitious programs, has ambitious vision. The 10-year health plan sets out a really a big case for change, and so that and you can see within schools you've got kind of a schools white paper planned. Reform around SEND, a new Ofsted framework, a curriculum and assessment review, and so already implemented policy making a difference to the day-to-day lives of people, breakfast clubs, free school meals, lifting children out of poverty. And so we can see that the government has begun, but the big question now is how can it deliver on its ambitions? Are we in the zone of targets, markets, competition? Or do we need to go further? There's a lot of ideas floating around think tanks: relational models, agile and nimble delivery, empowering staff, using the insights from the front line, changing culture, changing leadership. Which of these are real successes? Is it an and or an or between the kind of targets, markets, regulation approach of the past? And then, like, how attractive are those things to our political leaders? Like, what are the tensions and the pressures that they feel? You know, and the obvious ones are the kind of the length of time it takes to deliver, but the political imperative for people to feel a difference now. And so, closing on these remarks, I think there's whichever of these methods we choose, and or the interaction between them, there's a real case for our political leaders to be bold and brave. We're in a new world, we're in a new context, and the old methods aren't going to deliver as much as we need them to. And so questions broadly for our panelists. How do they see the role of the state in delivering? Questions around the how, and what should Labour's ethos be for public service reform? What are the practical steps that need to be taken next? What are the tensions and the pressures on leaders? And so I'll hand over now to Tom to begin with a set of opening remarks, and then we'll move to Lord Adebowale, Caroline, and then Sam.
Thank you. It's probably worth going back, and one of the reasons I mentioned I was Director of Policy in opposition is because some of this early thinking was, of course, kind of brought on in the, I think it was in 2023 when we started doing the kind of mission delivery like idea about the structure of government. And I'm sure we can get into kind of how it is now, but the reality at the time was it did try and set a kind of the beginning of a kind of how do we rewrite the state to help deliver some of the big goals, especially considering the inheritance that we knew that we were going to get required, you know, not just small tweaks to the system, but big reforms. And like looking back, I reread the document published, which I'm sure very few people read at the time, but it did set some goals which, you know, stayed true in terms of what the government are trying to achieve. Again, possibly still looking at those, the mechanisms that they need to get there. But, you know, it broadly was how do you switch to long-term thinking on these things and stop the kind of short-termism, you know. On the positive note, you could argue that this year has been the year of essentially 10-year plans and strategies, which at least sets the kind of starting gun on those things, with delivery questions remaining, obviously, on all of them. The other point was that missions and the kind of idea of government was meant to be very invitational to other actors, whether it was private sector, civil society, local government, all. It was meant to be a very kind of joined-up partnership approach to working. And then thirdly was about how do you set those kind of measurable outcomes and have them both be ambitious and attainable, and you know, a bunch of questions there underlying it around the kind of incentives and frameworks. But I think it is important to think that like there was thinking about this going on, you know, before the election, knowing that transformational change was needed. Now, without getting into the kind of where are they now and how are they delivered, I think now moving on, the question is what are the big levers that are needed, or the big kind of questions that remain over all of government's agenda, especially as some of those strategies, which have set out very ambitious plans, and it's very welcome that there's strategies, and I think most people have essentially accepted, you know, and been very positive about them. But the question always remains, how do you deliver with them? And there's a number, I mean, it's such a huge question about how you create an active state. There were certainly at least three things at the top of like my mind when I think where the kind of conversation really needs to like focus its energy. I think first of all, just looking at the kind of vertical of government, I think there is still this remaining question about how the centre of government, and I say that both the very centre with a capital C, the kind of Treasury Cabinet Office, number 10, Whitehall itself, but then the kind of relationship with what is delivered locally. And like, you know, the direction to me is only really one way in terms of where we're going on that, and that is, you know, down to, you know, strategic authorities or the neighbourhood level, and there clearly remains some tensions about how you do that, and where kind of power lies in that system. But that is a huge question I do think can be taken as a mantle, especially when you think, how do you embed this over a number of years? I think that is one way to do it. I think there is a big question over the kind of horizontal integration. I mean, we all know, like, essentially the big problem at the moment is all these problems require, you know, multi-agency, multi-departmental approaches, but we have an institutional architecture which is completely siloed. You know, the very obvious one to look at is just the fiscal siloing of everything. But when you look at, you know, how do you create more preventative services, all these kind of things, like, it's extremely hard when you've got, you know, 16 to 24 different departments, all with very separate lines in the budget and different incentives. And that obviously feeds through from both centre government, but also down to local government. And then I think the last question is on, you know, the kind of accountability side of this, because, you know, there's huge questions and you know, for all services, I think there is been a bit of a myth of accountability in the system across, you know, whether it's the police, whether it's health, whether it's, you know, inquiries. You know, we've had this kind of essentially a failing system of checks and balances and incentives in the system. And clearly a lot of work has gone on, including on all those three areas. But that, especially when you pair that up with the kind of first 2 points on, you know, where power lies in the system, locally or centrally, I think that accountability question is going to be a very big one.
Thank you very much, Tom. Lord Adebowale.
Victor will do
Victor.
nice. Yeah, we know each other. We work in the same. It's fine. So, I don't know, the questions. So we're in Liverpool, right? And on Sunday I went to see some social enterprises and some businesses, social trading organisations set up by an organisation called Kindred. And whenever I come to cities, because I don't consider myself, it's great, I don't really work for anybody, I go and have a look at what's going on. And what I discovered in Liverpool, and I've known this for a while, is that you have high growth, which is a definition. It's not like me making it up, but they are defined as high growth businesses, growing 37% year on year, employing people, regenerating whole areas that were dumps beforehand, putting money in people's pockets, giving them hope, moving them beyond understanding that actually running a business, being engaged is for them, you know, as opposed to people that watch on telly or people that the Chancellor talks about. And I thought to myself that these people have done this in spite of everything that the government has done, frankly. It's not because of government, it's almost in spite of government. And I've spent most of my life and most of my career almost working on things that happen in spite of government. So social enterprises, some of you know this, but I'll just say it, they contribute more to Britain's GDP than the agriculture and the entertainment industry put together. Those aren't my numbers, they're the Treasury's numbers. Right? The top 11 social enterprises pay more tax than Google, Apple, Facebook put together. And yet, when I go and see the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the Prime Minister, over 70, I'm persistent. I've been the chair for a long time, and I was a chief exec for an even longer time because I'm persistent. It's foolish, actually. I should have given up years ago. What I see is just this massive gap between the potential down there and the conversations up here. And there's a massive disconnect. And let me give you a sort of the notion in organisational psychology, which is that the people at the top of organisations, even in the best organisations, understand about 20% of what's going on. Right? The people in the middle understand about 30%. This is very crude, based on work of Barry Oshry, if you want to know. And the people at the bottom, the people who actually have to do the work, they understand the remaining 50%. And I see government like that. And because I've been in and out of Number 10 for many years, and the same experience I have is that the fascination with the plan and planning and the intellectual machinations of that process, what you might call politics, isn't really that effective. Because if it was, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in. And the people that are at the sharp end of the inverse care law in relation to all this, and that's in spite of some of the good things you've mentioned, they know it. They know that actually you can change the way your community operates in a couple of years, as opposed to waiting for a promise that might never even touch your community. They know it, right? So I think if you believe, and I happen to believe, that the threat from the right, and I think talking about reform is a bit pointless, there is a threat from fundamentally, they're fascists. Populism, you call it what you like, that's what they are. There's a link between Tommy Robinson and the others, and it doesn't really matter what form they take, that's where we're at. And we have now got to the position where conversations that were considered fringe 10 years ago are now mainstream, right? So you either believe there's an existential threat to all of us, right? You know, I happen to be a 6-foot black guy, they're definitely going to try and deport me, right? And you, just being honest, my life will be made miserable. But if you think that you're safe because you don't look like me, I think you're wrong. If you believe that the existential threat is real, then the response has to be different. It cannot be sort of incrementalism, however it's promised. It has to be based on the notion that we think long and learn short, right? So what that means is you come to places like Liverpool, you understand what it is that they're doing that actually means that they are a high growth area for the people that need the growth most, right? And you give them the same trust that you give people who say they're going to invest 150 billion quid in the country, but none of it appears to touch the sides, right? And then you learn with them. That's what you do. And the evidence that it works is that that's how we got the NHS, right? Those of you that think the NHS, I mean, you're all smart people, but you know that the NHS was started in a village in Tredegar, and the people of Tredegar designed something that worked for them, a health and social care system that worked for them. And Nye Bevan, who was from Tredegar, had the common sense to realise that it wasn't, whatever you had to do, and you had to do it quickly, because people were restive, he wasn't going to be done in Whitehall. So he went to Tredegar, saw what they were doing, and basically said, this is the model that I'm going to work on with these people in order to Tredegarise the health system. He actually used that term. Now, I do not see politicians, I'll be honest, I don't see the Labour politicians, I don't see any politicians actually having the humility and the vision to do that, or even to allow it to be done. And that worries me, because one of the things that the right, the fascists are doing, is pretending to do that. So Nigel Farage, when he does his talks in pubs where people are at, there's no talk of white papers, strategies, plans. Everybody gets bought a pint, and he talks about their dreams, their aspirations. And then he blames people who are various shades of me for not having them. It's emotional, but it works. Right? If you believe that we're facing an existential threat, you don't have to believe it. I happen to believe it. But if you believe we're facing that threat, then we have to have the same connection with those dreams and aspirations. And we have to make hope possible as opposed to despair logical. And we're not doing that, and we're not doing it fast enough. So if you want to know what the role of government is, it is to do that. It's not just the survival of government. In the North East, I'll just give you one more example. I happen to, because I'm curious, I happen to chair the NHS Confederation, and I'll tell you, you know, some of the best hospitals in the country were in the North East, round about Newcastle, right? But Newcastle, while it had some of the best run hospitals in the country, had some of the worst outcomes for the poorest people we've ever had. And you might ask yourself, why is that? Well, I'll tell you. The institutions were run for the benefit of the institutions. And the people who ran them got all kinds of plaudits, but the outcomes were terrible. So when you talk about accountability, it's not rocket science. If you're spending, what is it, over 200 billion pounds of my tax dollar, and the outcomes are crap, who do you hold accountable? It's not the people who are using the service, it's the people who commissioned that service who didn't understand the people for whom they were commissioning. It's not difficult, and it's scalable. So I think that unless, you know, Keir Starmer's going to make his speech, and I hope it is a revolutionary one in which he's prepared to take risks on behalf of people who need those risks to be taken, as opposed to do what is safe for the institution that these people pay for. Because it won't work. And they know it won't work, which is why they're voting reform. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Victor. Caroline.
Thank you. So I've thought about the question of active government in two main ways. Firstly, in terms of activity, so what is the government doing, how much is it doing, and also about active government in terms of the depth of the interventions that government are making. And I've written about these in a recent report from Onward called State Jacket, which is broadly quite similar to Sam's book, in fact, about the deep dysfunctions within the state, how we've got into a mess, and also some ideas about how you might start to come out of it. So firstly, on activity, I think it's a classic trap to fall into, particularly for new governments or governments that are constantly in reshuffle, to look at how you can look very busy and how you can have the stream of grid announcements that are constantly churning through the news, which is a totally natural reaction. But actually, driving towards either very big numbers or very small numbers of whatever the policy is as quickly as possible isn't necessarily the right approach at all. There are all sorts of perverse incentives that are driven by this sort of government through looking busy and being very active approach. So to take health as a prime example of this, far too many parts of the health system, whether it's GP appointments, whether it's A&E targets, whether it's waiting lists, people are reduced to a unit of activity. The fact of having an appointment, the fact of moving before the 4-hour target in A&E, before that cut-off happens, to just being moved through the system to a different part, rather than looking, exactly as Victor has touched on, rather than looking about the overall outcomes. Has that person got better as a result of having had that appointment? Has their life improved? Has their standard of living improved as a result of that interaction with an arm of the state? And this is a totally natural reaction. It's not to in any way say that the people working in those systems are doing anything wrong at all. It's that that's how the funding flows out of government. Trusts are paid for units of activity. GPs are paid for having had numbers of appointments. That's just how the system is geared, and it creates all sorts of things that aren't necessarily geared to what the health service is meant to be doing, which is making people better. So then looking instead at the other part of how I've thought about the active state, which is about the depth of the intervention. And to take a different example to health and look at the welfare system. During COVID, while I was an advisor in the last government, there was, again, a very natural reaction to expand lots of pots of money to try and do as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and to do it in a targeted way to try and get to those people on the lowest incomes who were least able to adapt to rapidly rising prices and a very volatile labour market. But what has happened as a result of that is a mess of different schemes that people in receipt of certain benefits have to constantly jump through hoops to apply for. And actually, there's a lot of literature from more left-leaning think tanks about the cognitive load and the bandwidth of people who are in deprivation or in poverty, who have to expend a huge amount of effort thinking not about how they could improve their lives through thinking about work and taking risks and doing things differently, but instead to jump through all of the hoops that the government has set for them to try and draw down as much money as quickly as possible from the different arms of the state. And that's not in their long-term best interests either. So I think it's really important to think when you're designing policy and thinking about the pots of money that you make available to people as to whether that person having to interact with the state, whether what they are spending their effort doing is actually in their overall best interests, and whether the marginal incentive then to do that risk-taking or that work-seeking behaviour is incentivized. So I'll stop there for now, and there's many different bits that we could jump into from there. But I think it's just really important to think when you're talking about active government to not pursue activity for activity's sake and not to pursue targeting very deeply, when actually there are voluntary sector organisations, local organisations that may be far better placed than the government trying to design a perfect system that works for everywhere, right from the centre.
Thank you. Sam, how do we fix it?
Thanks. Good morning, everybody, and I'll pick up on that last point in what I say. So in my book, which I noticed is available in the conference bookshop, I essentially focus on the loss of state capacity over the last 40 years, and the fact the state is just simply less functional than it was in a much more complicated world in which it is trying to do a lot more, which means whether you have good or bad politicians, it's really difficult to make anything happen. Obviously, if you have Liz Truss, it's impossible to make anything happen. But if you have, even if you have people who are well-intentioned and trying to do the right thing, it's really difficult to make things happen. And that loss of state capacity, the biggest part of that, I'm not going to try and cover the whole book, but the biggest part of that is in the destruction of local government over the last 40 years. Local government in this country does not really run public services. Most schools, hospitals, prisons, police are all run centrally, which is pretty much not true anywhere else in the developed world. We have a situation in which 95% of tax revenue is raised by central government, not local government. Again, that is by far the highest in the developed world. And that was a deliberate policy of the Conservatives in the 1980s and 90s, but New Labour continued it and didn't push back particularly against it. They weren't huge fans of local government either. Certainly the last government significantly cut local authority budgets, even further took more powers away from local authorities. And that has left us in a situation where we have this incredible loss of state capacity. And central government isn't able to run everything itself. It doesn't have the ability to do so. It doesn't have the knowledge. It doesn't have the local knowledge to do so. So what it ends up doing is contracting out a lot of the work. So what we have is a situation in which you have almost a shadow state run by private companies, delivering an awful lot of what in other countries is done by local government. Apologies if there's anyone from Serco or Capita in the room, but Serco and Capita are essentially now a shadow state providing a lot of public services. The most extreme example, which I talk about in the book, is the fact that children's homes are now nearly all run by for-profit providers, mostly run by private equity firms, making extremely high levels of marginal profit and charging about £6,000 a week on average for a child in care, up from about £3,000 a decade or so ago. And it is crazy to be in a position where in any other country this is run by the state. In our country, it is being run for profit and often with incredibly poor outcomes for the children involved. But the same is true of social care, the same is true of nurseries. You can go across multiple different parts of what should be part of the state, but isn't because of this loss of local capacity.
Two things.
So what can you do about that? Well, we have started to create a mechanism where you can do something about that in the form of, for the first time, we have a regional tier of government in mayors. We don't have them everywhere in the country yet. About 60% of the country, 70% of the country is now covered by a mayor. That the aim is to get that to 100%. At the moment, they have some powers. Their role is more focused on the economy than public services. But it is an obvious place, given that they have some level of scale and size, but also a local, regional focus, to start moving down and decentralizing quite a lot of these parts of the state that the centre is simply incapable of running. If you look at the NHS, for instance, a lot of this sort of conversation about NHS reform always ends up coming back to should we have a social insurance model, should we have a taxpayer-funded model? That's irrelevant. You look at international studies, there's no difference between taxpayer-funded and social insurance models in terms of outcomes. But where we are different from other taxpayer-funded systems like Denmark, like Spain, is in how centralised our system is. And that causes immense problems when you're trying to look at reform of the system. So if you look at what's happened over the last couple of decades, there's been this huge desire to have integrated care, to have fewer people in hospitals, to have more people being treated preventatively or being given preventative help to avoid requiring treatment, to be treated at outside hospitals, to be supported in primary care. And that hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened because the centre keep reimposing its vision on the system. So we had Jeremy Hunt created integrated care boards that were supposed to do this, were supposed to be sort of integrating at a local level, and then they were just given central targets. And so naturally they respond to the central targets, which is what their jobs were dependent on. And now this government has sort of somewhat eviscerated integrated care boards and taken away NHS England and centralised further. But actually what you need to do is start pushing down. If you're serious about integration, the only way you can do integration is at local and regional level, where you actually have every part of the process from preventative, primary and secondary in one place, and you're able to focus on that part of the system rather than the sort of top-down version. And the same is true of multiple different policy areas. And we're starting to see this shift. It's very slow. In Manchester, they are currently setting up their own children's homes. They've built their own children's homes, which then local authorities in Manchester Authority are commissioning into. So that's a small shift away from the sort of model of doing it privately. We're starting to see the state capacity build up, but I want to see this government go much, much further and much, much faster on doing it. And I know not every mayor is the most popular person at the moment with the Labour Party leadership for various reasons. We can make the job bigger and more exciting so they don't want to become Prime Minister, is the obvious answer. But what I'd like to say, two things. Firstly is decentralisation, devolution of more powers over public services, not a ridiculously fast pace because they're not strong enough yet. It would knock over the mayoral authorities to do that too quickly. But for a start, you could say the mayor is chair of their integrated care board. You could start shifting power over schools, over hospitals, towards the mayors. We're doing it a bit with police. Most of the mayors are now the police commissioner for their area, or a lot of them are police commissioner for their area. So you do that, but also to really make it work, you have to do fiscal devolution, which the Treasury hate. But unless areas can raise their own money, they are always supplicant to central government. They're always dependent on what central government is willing to let them do. They have no ability to really make their own decisions about prioritisation. So you have to start. I would start in the budget. I'd start with a tourist tax that local areas were able to raise, which doesn't even affect local people, and they could use that to start building their own capacity up and to deliver on their own priorities. But then ultimately we need to go much further if we're serious about building that state capacity back up again.
Thank you, Sam. Victor, you wanted to make a couple of points.
First of all, I haven't got a book out. I will have in a year. It'll be a bestseller. But the thing, there's a couple of things. First of all, the state has generally been quite a poor provider of children's services. I mean, the stats as an example on children in care hasn't changed much for 15 years. 80,800 kids in care at any one time, 8,800 leaving the job alive. Social enterprises, however, have a really good track record, not only in healthcare, but in children's care. Healthcare, you look at the CQC, the top 2% of providers, social enterprises. So I think the rush to the state isn't always particularly useful. I'd like to see some new ideas. I think the state should create the conditions for everything that you've just said in terms of it's not just top-down, structural, it's also bottom-up. It's releasing some of that energy which actually exists in places like Liverpool and Manchester, etc. You take the foot off the neck. But also to provide some boundaries within which that activity can be done in a way which is useful for everyone. So one of the experiments that we did run was something called Connected Care. There's a couple of people in this room that might remember it. And it was a way of getting local people to design and deliver preventative services that meant that people didn't need to go to hospital. And it actually worked. And the reason why it's not happening isn't because it didn't work, it was because it butted against the power base of local authorities who felt they should be doing it and they should control it. And so they killed it. I can tell you the conversations, despite the fact that the London School of Economics evaluation showed that for every £1 you spent in that way, you got £4 return, and that return increased depending on the poverty of the community that you applied it in. So we just need to be careful about the swing from one solution to another that misses out the understanding and the energy which actually exists in communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're much more likely to get engagement with that kind of much more local social enterprise if it's being procured at that kind of regional or local level than if you're doing it. I mean, part of the problem with central procurement model of doing things is is essentially only large companies who are used to bidding for large contracts win those things because they're so big. Whereas at a local level, whether you're looking at preventative care or children's care, you can bring in social enterprises much more easily than you can.
Okay. So, sorry, I don't want to have a debate between you and me because I think you're lovely and we agree on lots of things. But people confuse procurement with commissioning. They're not the same thing. Right? Commissioning is the means by which you understand the needs of an individual and/or a community such that you can build a platform for. Commissioning is best done locally. Procurement needs rules, and those rules need to mitigate against the sorts of avaricious greed that you've mentioned. And contracting, purchasing, needs to show that it will create value for the taxpayer. So I do agree with you, but I think we need to be really careful about the terms that we use because they have an impact on what we do, how we structure interventions.
Caroline, would you like to come in on this point?
I mean, I broadly agree with everything that's been said by the other two people here already.
Cool, let's go.
Which might surprise some people. But I think the point about how things can be done much better at a local level, and also how, again, something that Sam has written about much more eloquently than I have, about how grants are decided and the big shift in the commissioning of local services and how local government gets money, a move from everybody getting a share of a grant to having to compete and sign up to various terms and conditions and report back in a very onerous way back to central government in order to deliver services. It is precisely the wrong way to go about it. It means that councils spend a vast amount of energy standing up teams simply to bid for money for a service that they will never deliver because there isn't enough money to go around for everyone. So I totally agree with what's already been said about how we could do it entirely differently by going more locally and perhaps looking more at how that money could be directly transferred to social enterprises rather than having this mad competitive system that goes from one stage of government to the other, to the other, to the other.
It's not just councils, by the way. So there are social enterprises that bid for staff. And if you have a win rate of 1 in 5, it still costs you the money to bid for 5 of those bids. It's a waste of money. So I set up Collaborate, which is an organisation which is all about the opposite of competition. Because if you're bidding for something, say in Liverpool, say it's 10 million, and you're big enough to bid for that 10 million on your own as an organisation, that shouldn't be, that's the difference. So the procurement process should say to that organisation, you're not going to win this bid unless you show us that your supply chain consists of organisations that can reach into that Bangladeshi community or that African Caribbean community. Unless you can show us you're going to do that, no point in bidding. And you would see a shift in the way those organisations operate.
Okay, thank you, Victor. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience, and then Tom, you'll be first to respond, given that we haven't come to you yet on the other issues. Questions from the audience? Great stuff. So I'll take 3 at a time. Lady at the back to start with.
Thank you. My name is Julie Bass. I'm Chief Executive of Turning Point, an organisation I think, Victor, you know rather well.
Never heard of you.
I mean, I agree with so much of what's been said, but one of the things we're trying to do at Turning Point, which is a national social enterprise that reaches over 200,000 people every year now, is to try and use some of our national learning and understanding to work with ICBs and work with a system. Because we can work quite effectively at place and reach into many diverse communities, which is really what we're there for. But we just can't really find the right way into the conversation. Because, you know, what we find is VCSE, very small VCSE organisations, often at local level, are invited into a conversation. But really what we want to see is more leadership from social enterprises that can bring social models in, as opposed to medical models moving into neighbourhoods and communities. So I'm wondering if there's any way or any thoughts that the panel might have on how the larger scale VCSE can work more effectively with a system. Because we support local VCSE as well. It isn't national versus local. We work in partnership with those people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yep.
I'll go with that.
Gentleman in the end. Just to keep you running around.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. My name's Josh Ramsey. I have a question about the kind of devolving or localization of services. I've seen a lot of conversation about that, especially in the healthcare space. This panel kind of started it with talking about reform and their fascism, but a lot of local government seems to be controlled. You know, you have reform mayors, and so I was just wondering, when we're talking about the localization, would you have some services which are done by local government that are in control, that reform control, and that would look much different from something that is kind of a consistently Labour-controlled government? Or are we kind of talking less about the leadership and more the actual people working in local government themselves that are doing that? And would they be impacted by that leadership and the shift there?
I'm not quite sure what the question is.
Over here, we'll come to you next in the next round.
Hi, I'm Rob. I work for a medicine company called Lilly, but I've also worked in government. I'd be interested, particularly in Tom's perspective, but also the other panellists. What is Labour's vision around how they're going to operate and shift the state? So you've got one department, say like education, that are reducing freedoms locally with academies. On the other side, in health, I think there's a slightly different agenda and a slightly different theory of change. When you think about how they're trying to deal with regulators, they're setting up regulators in some areas and scrapping them or curtailing their freedoms in others. What's the sense of a kind of joined up agenda? And we've got the Prime Minister's speech today, which to Sam's point about decentralising is about a national NHS online service, which is very much a national kind of offer. So just interested in the reflections about how joined up the story is and what signals we should take about what their vision for change is.
Thank you.
That's an easy question. Gwendolyn?
Tom, what is Labour's vision for services?
I might start with the first two,
I'll let you.
and I'll come on to this because it is a really good question. I hope this answers the first two questions, which, if not, we can come back. But look, entirely in agreement with everyone and everything that everyone's just put out here. Like, it feels that we all know that most things are better delivered when you know your local community, you're involved there, you tailor solutions to it, and you know, whether it's devolving down to government, whether it's devolving from a kind of commissioning basis to be delivered by social enterprises or civil society, like, generally, that is the direction of travel that most people feel. The thing that I was trying to say in the first bit is we need to face the political reality. And I can say, you know, I'm not in government anymore, and I'm not, I'm not a special advisor. But like, we have to ask the question, why is it that it has been, a long road of decades into stripping capacity from local government? What are the tensions in the centre where the worries remain? Because, like, the truth is, this has happened for a reason. Like, there is a political reality that there is, of course, a nervousness that once you give away control from the centre, you are accountable to the public. You've put out your manifesto. You've probably set out a bunch of targets. Like, you need to then face the question, and everyone can sit here and say, yeah, just give, powers out. But ultimately, Prime Minister and the Cabinet at the end of the day are going to be the ones that are sat and judged against the services that are locally delivered, obviously against also local councillors. So that, when it comes back, and it sounds a bit boring on the kind of accountability front, but to answer the question of like how you manage that tension, like there are some really important questions that are being raised, and you have to put your cabinet minister hat on, thinking, am I going to sit here and sign away some power that I have to do a local government, which could be reform-led, and or it could be conservative-led, it could be a coalition, it could be Labour-led, and that to answer your question, like yes, that is ultimately what devolution is. You need to set up a framework which, whether it's setting minimum standards across the country so everyone has a certain expectation, but then above that giving everyone a freedom to go. It comes back to the point you were making about, what's your, how do you measure, activity on a basis? Like it's nuts that we measure so many kind of different activity levels. So you perhaps need to start looking at what is it we're measuring councils on if we're giving them freedoms. Like you need some form of control. You can never just give anything away politically. I mean, that's just like a reality of it. So you do need to think about like what are the kind of the top level outcomes on these things. There are then also questions, just to go back to the first one, like some things probably shouldn't be devolved down. Like there are some perhaps like things which we should procure on a national level, some innovations which perhaps, from a cost basis might be better. It might be also, and this comes back to the how do you find, to Victor's point at the start, if there's something great going on, somewhere like with the NHS example, how do you scale? And that is a really tough question. How do you build kind of best practice systems where if those best performing councils, and a lot of people can point to the top 20 councils that are doing some excellent work across the country, and I think, we'll have many examples of where there's brilliant prevention work, but then underneath that, there is this kind of flabby middle of how do you actually get all that brilliant work going there? And so when, ministers are faced with the question of, are you just going to devolve everything out? There's these 20 brilliant councils doing things. You need to answer the questions of like, what are the safeguards in the system? How are those councils that don't have the capacity? And we all know that like pretty much the biggest like reason for councils doing brilliant things is brilliant leadership. And there are brilliant leadership. How do you spread that leadership around the country? And so I think, a lot of people will feel the same about where, delivery, commissioning should lie in the system, but it does need to face the kind of political reality of how you do that. Otherwise, we'll just be sat on the same stage in a year's time doing exactly the same talk. On the last question about...
Before you get there, Tom, I think you've said a little bit of this, but how do we give those kind of centralised decision makers confidence? What are the answers in the system?
It is a really tough question. I think it does come back to setting a very clear understanding of what your accountability framework and intervention mechanisms are. Like, you need to be able to know that if you are devolving something, like someone locally in any neighbourhood should at least expect X of some form of a national standard, and you should set a bar low that if it goes below, there are certain intervention mechanisms that are happening. We've seen it in Wes talk about how, he'll be happy to, get rid of NHS managers if they're not delivering. Equally, those who are top performing when they're kind of at the very top of the thing, they can get more autonomy and to be able to deliver and have have more freedom to do the good things that they want to do. I'm not saying that's the perfect model, but it is a way in which you can give comfort to ministers who are worried about giving it away.
Thank you. And then on the last question.
On the last question. Look, it's tough to have a single framework across all public services. Like education and health are at a very different point in time on their kind of public service reform journey on a number of different elements of it. Like ultimately, you know, let's face it, it's been 14 years out of government. They've spent the first year coming in where they've essentially opened the bonnet and looked at all the different kind of problems that they've had. And you know, Wes has obviously done a 10-year plan. Bridget, you know, had the bill at the start of the year and is kind of grappling with a number of things there. It is hard to, I think there are read acrosses which unfortunately have got lost. Like I would slightly push back, for example, on some of the accountability and kind of intervention stuff. Like there are read acrosses on improvement teams, you know, as a mechanism. You know, coming back to my point about being a bit of an accountability myth and an inspection myth, like, you know, both have identified that there is really no support mechanism for kind of relatively failing trusts or schools. So they have put some resource into, you know, the regional school improvement teams and some of the various teams in the NHS to go out. I think they are, however, just dealing with slightly different problems at the moment. You know, obviously Bridget's argument on the academies would be it's not about really taking freedoms, it's just that, you know, it is about providing a kind of a standard across the system as well to what you expect. Like academies, there have been lots of successes and, you know, the line from Labour is that they are pro-academy, like it's not an anti-academy thing, but equally underneath those successes there are problems in the academy system which she's looking to give. I mean, you know, I wouldn't stand here and profess to give Bridget's answer to it, but I think essentially they're dealing with different problems. There are some read acrosses, and I imagine over time as their kind of reform journeys are at different points might align, then you would see further alignment.
Thanks, Tom. Sam, did you have any comments?
Yeah, a couple of comments. So on the sort of local government and reform and sort of how do you sort of get consistency? I mean, firstly, the government are reintroducing supplementary vote for mayoral elections, which will help mean you won't get mayors being elected on 25-30% of the vote, which will help, I think, a bit. But actually, I don't think it's a bad thing for reform to have some experience of local government. And when they do, and when they have to interact with reality, it changes the way they think. It's very easy for Nigel Farage to say whatever the hell he likes because there's no accountability and he doesn't have to do anything in the real world. If you look at what, say, the reform leadership in Kent, the local authority, they actually wrote to the Home Secretary saying, please allow care workers to have visas. They were to the left of Labour on immigration because it actually causes them a real problem in hiring enough people to work in care in Kent. You know, you've got the mayor in Hull, the Luke Campbell, the reform mayor in Hull, working with Labour mayors on environmental infrastructure that his own party are theoretically opposed to. Andrea Jenkins said she was going to fire all the equality diversity officers and then realised there weren't any. You know, this is actually quite useful for them to experience reality. And I don't think it's a reason not to proceed with devolution. If they don't do well, they'll lose the elections next time around. To the point around sort of how do you give central politicians comfort around devolving? I mean, in a way you can't. You have to take a leap of faith. One of the reasons why we don't have enough brilliant leadership in local government is because it's not powerful. It's not where ambitious people want to go a lot of the time because it's not where you don't get to do as much as you would do in other countries. If you start to devolve more, you will get better people wanting to work in local government. There's a sort of chicken and egg problem. So there has to be a bit of a leap of faith at some point. You can't both have your control and decentralise. You can definitely put frameworks in place. You can definitely have some accountability standards. But at some point, you need to say, we need to try something different. On the point about vision, honestly, I mean, as I don't work for the party and never have, I can sort of say more. I don't think there is one. I don't think there is a central vision for public services across government. I think you have got quite different approaches being taken in education, health, and policing and other areas. And that is because there isn't really a vision at the centre in the way there was when... I was about to say when there was under Blair, but Blair took a while to get there. There was a clear vision in Blair's second term of what public service reform looked like. It wasn't really there in the first term. You had Frank Dobson doing something very different from the NHS, from what David Blunkett was doing on schools. So maybe it will come, because it didn't come straight away with New Labour, but I don't think it's there at the moment because you don't have a clear central sense of what public service reform looks like. So it is ministers freelancing and trying to come up with their own plans.
Thank you, Sam. Victor, would you like to take any of those questions?
So Julie's question is the perennial question for the providers of large-scale services that aren't in the public sector and aren't in the NHS. And most providers have come to it quite late. So I think when I was the chief executive at Turning Point, I used to talk about you need to learn to speak NHS, right? Because if you're not understood, you're 50% responsible. There are examples in places like Manchester of collaborations, and in Liverpool actually, between not-for-dividend organisations. I don't really do the charity stuff or the civil society because it's a nonsense. Like, what's the opposite of a civil society? Do you know what I mean? Where large organisations have created consortia, provider networks that are really commercial and can articulate an offer to the public sector which is both attractive and in the right language and can lead the supply chain. But it takes time, and if you haven't done it before, it takes more time and it takes a different kind of leadership than generally has been the case in the not-for-dividend sector. I don't think that central government have provided enough of a framework for that to happen. By the way, in relation to accountability, I do see your point about realpolitik, and everybody says that. But everything that I've said is evidence-based. It's not as though the minister would be taking any risk at all by investing in Liverpool, because she, if it's the Chancellor, she'd be investing in something that has worked, is working, and is scalable. And by the way, governments often invest in organisations that they have no clue. I mean, the stories are riddled with it, and they waste money. So I don't really, I'm struggling with that notion of, you know, who's taking the risk, right? And frankly, where the Labour Party is now, they need to take some risks. It's about judgment, which is frankly what we pay them for. So I do think it's early days for many large providers. Some are better than others. I think it requires a slightly different infrastructure, a slightly different approach to the commercial realities of supply chain management and expressing outcomes. The evidence that it works is that under the Blair government, the private sector got together to make an offer on hospital waiting times, remember, for hip and knee surgery, that released a whole different way of procuring that allowed those private sector organisations, by and large, to make a lot of money and bring down the waiting list. This government hasn't done anything as good, frankly, and it could. And it could do that with the voluntary sector. On the vision thing, I think vision's really important. It is true that without vision, people die. And I keep hearing this notion that Keir Starmer isn't that interested in vision. That's a problem, because everybody knows that successful organisations have an alignment between vision, mission, strategy, and operations, but it starts with vision. And I do think the vision for public services is a bit confused, actually. And I would recommend that if there is going to be a vision, it should start with the aspirations of the recipients of public services rather than the political requirements of the people who spend our money. That might be a good place to start. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Victor. Caroline.
Yeah, so a few points to pick up on. On the Joshua's question about reform, I think there's a degree to which, actually, to some extent, having lots of reform councils will allow sunlight to be the best disinfectant and will expose what's been said about reform pursuing the wrong sorts of policies at a local level and how that then translates to national policy. I should declare an interest that I'm one of those very foolish people, not for reform, who are putting themselves forward to stand at the next local election.
Well done.
So whether I'm the wrong sort of person or the right sort of person, I'll leave others to decide whether that's the right thing or not. But I think there's a really important point about local government at the moment is such a closed shop in terms of when the wrong policies are pursued and councils end up in serious financial difficulty, they go into this weird brokering system with central government for a bailout fund. And this is done entirely behind closed doors without the electorate having any say over the eventual settlement, which is usually that council taking on even more debt than they already have. But there's no automatic referendum mechanism for the local people to decide whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing. And this often means that even when councils have failed for taking the wrong sorts of risks, they remain in post, the same party will remain in post, rather than there being any sort of churn that might get some of those people who have made those wrong decisions and make them actually accountable for that. I also think there's a whole lot wrong with allowing officials to remain in local government when they have been responsible for some of the poor advice. Actually, it's both at local level and at national level. When bad advice has been given, there is almost no recourse, and those people are so well protected. And it's the politicians that end up taking the flak for it, whether or not it was them making a judgment based on the basis of what was written down and showed to them at the time. So I also think we really need to take the fight to reform on just how astronomical their spending commitments are. If you add up all of the things that they have committed to, both in terms of tax cuts and new spending commitments, the size of the black hole that they are proposing to come into government with is roughly equivalent to the entire size of the NHS budget. It's just insane, and I don't think that many people have started focusing properly squarely on adding up those policies and saying, this just cannot work. And it cannot work in a very real way, and it probably won't work in the run into the election when they are then forced to make choices, when they are asked the hard questions about trade-offs. What are you actually going to do, and what are you not going to do, and in what order, and over what time frame? And hopefully that will wake people up to the fact that many of their policies are not serious, they are not sensible, and if people aren't waking up to that on the basis of journalists reporting in it or politicians asking them hard questions, then it will be the bond markets that wake people up to it as a real prospect of reform coming into government will really, really scare the markets in a much more serious way than what's happening at the moment with the size of the fiscal crisis going into the autumn.
I hope you're right, I really do. But note that people are, what reform is doing isn't logical, it's emotional. And I agree that the reform councils are not the same as a reform government. You know, people will see chaos because they don't have a plan. That's not the point. The point of reform is to tap into anger. And when you're angry as some of the people that vote reform are, you're not thinking. So when I talk about an existential threat, I'm not talking about a nice journey down a logical path of discovery. I'm talking about rage, anger, emotion. The kinds of things that are going on in America after 9 months of Trump government is what's coming here. So we just need to be careful not to think that we're in the sort of nice, logical place. We're not. We're in a highly emotional place where logical argument and evidence is not available to us as a tool for argument. Vision is, actual experience is, dynamic change is, and presence is. But intellectual, not so much. And the evidence for that is they keep going up in the polls, despite the evidence of their complete lack of what we call a policy agenda.
Thank you, Victor. And I'm afraid I haven't got any time for another round of questions. I think that's a great note to leave the discussion on. We've had brilliant contributions from our panellists, so I know that you'll join me in thanking them. Thank you, everyone.
Well chaired.
Thank you. Well done.
you.